Hello, everyone, and welcome to Future Nonprofit, a podcast and YouTube channel where we sit down with industry experts, both in and out of the nonprofit space, to talk about how to build and scale the nonprofits our world needs tomorrow. I'm your host, Ted Vaughn, the co-author of Culture Built My Brand and the co-founder of Historic Agency. If you have not yet checked out the audio version of Future Nonprofit, it is a highly produced, amazing 20 to 30-minute journey through each of our guests' stories. Be sure and check that out. Like and follow us wherever you get your podcasts or here on YouTube. And I hope you really enjoyed today's episode. We talked to some amazing people. I like to ask people who are in very complicated roles or doing complicated things, if you had to explain what you do to a 5-year-old, what would you say? What would your answer be to explain your career to a 5-year-old?
When I had to explain what I do to my kids, I normally would explain it as there are people who don't have as much, who don't have necessities. And my job is to help the people who are helping them overcome that. And it was, we would see people on the street who were who were homeless. And I would be like, hey, remember how I said I help the people who help? We help people like that. I help them have money. I help them have resources so they can help people like this. And my kids really kind of accepted that. The people who struggle with it, I found more like the adults who are like, what does that mean? The ones who have like a lot more like questions about. My best friend always asks me, what do you do exactly? I don't know. And I'm like, okay, I'll try it again.
If you're walking onto a large platform to speak, in some sort of, imagine it like it's an auditorium or some sort of huge hall, and they every speaker needs to have their walk-on music, the track that accompanies them onto the stage. What's your track? What's your piece of music that you would want? That would be the Jaclyn branded walk on.
I don't really know the answer to that. I'm terrible with music. I'm just going to own that. But when we were at a conference in Kansas City recently, everybody had a walk-on track. And there's this song called Somebody in Kansas City Loves You. My husband's from Kansas City, and he used to send it to me. And I just thought that would be a great walk-on track for a conference in Kansas City.
And nobody else would have it.
No one else would. I don't think anybody else knows that this song exists. So I'm going to go with that because I was literally just thinking that question. What would it be? Very specific to a region, though.
I do want to start with, your origin story. What I find with every guest we talk to is that there is some aspect of their childhood or of their story of origin that tethers or relates or connects or is still meaningful to what they do today. For some, it was an experience they had as a kid. For some, it was what their parents did. For some, it was the way they were raised. Any number of different. What's yours? When you think about your story of origin, what is the thing, the person, the parent, the experience that most tethers or has shaped what you're doing today?
So mine isn't really metaphoric or mystic or deep. Literally, my father was a missionary, and he had to raise 50% of his support. And Friday nights, about once a month, when I could count, like if you could read a number, if you could count, you had to do BMC sorts at the Luis Palau office. And so there's probably a whole lot of direct mail letters that went out with like greasy little 5-year-old fingers, because this was before technology would order your printouts for you, right? So this was literally you pick up a piece of mail and you walk it to the BMC tray and you put it in order. And we would do it for thousands of pieces of mail that went out across America. And that's that from the time I was 5. So I've been doing some form.
You were violating child labor laws for Luis Palau.
I will say, when you work in nonprofit space, your children volunteer a lot.
That's awesome.
My mother did their press releases, again, before digital printing, when you have to have a dark room and run off those press photos with the captions and put them in envelopes and mail them out. My mother had a dark room in our house, and I learned how to use the enlarger and the developer and the stop and how to work in a dark room. So I've been doing this for a while.
Your earliest memory of what you wanted to be when you were growing up. Like for me, it was a stuntman because there's this great TV show I loved called The Fall Guy with Lee Majors, and I was like, I want to be a stuntman. What about you? What was your earliest memory of what you wanted to be when you grew up?
I mean, earliest was probably I wanted to be a chef or something, but I think, for that, what was it that drove me forward? I wanted to be Scully from the X-Files. I wanted to get my medical degree and join the FBI, and that's what I started, to go to college for. I dyed my hair red. I was fully obsessed.
That's amazing. Okay, so what aspect of Scully and of that type of deep forensic investigative role that she plays, what part of that is true for you today?
It's probably the deep forensic, but I got sidetracked in college with philosophy. I didn't get it, I didn't understand it, and I just kept taking classes because I had never been so challenged by a field of study, and I did not graduate with a degree in pre-med. I graduated with a degree in philosophy, and I still like that. I still like being challenged. I still like finding something I don't understand and really trying to parse it and dig in and bring light to it.
Did you ever not want, or let me ask it this way? Well, no, I'll back up. Take me on the journey from childhood to the role that you're in now, kind of like a stone skipping across the pond. What have been the primary roles that have kind of brought you to today?
My father, as I said, he's a missionary, and I started with, doing development work with him. One of my first jobs was working in the mailroom at the Plow Foundation, doing the BMC sorts, helping the volunteers, working in their large events, doing major donor research packets, those kind of things. When I was in college, I got this phone call and it was like, "Hey, we heard you want to work for us." And I was going to graduate in 3 months. I had no job. And a degree in philosophy. So I was like, yes, absolutely. And I hung up and started like Googling, like, who is this? And it was a group called the Domain Group. They don't exist anymore. And this was before the internet was useful. So I had no idea what they did. I showed up to the interview blind, hoping that I could figure out what we were talking about through context clues. I don't know how they got my resume. No one has ever owned that they sent them my resume. Um, and luckily, they started talking about direct mail, which I knew a lot about from my youth. And so I just faked it, acted like I had applied, and they offered me a job starting the next day, really. And I was like, I can't quit college 3 months away from graduation to take this job that I think was paying $27,000 a year. And I was literally going to still be below poverty line. Um, but they luckily called me the day I graduated from college 3 months later. Someone must have written it down and offered me the job starting Monday. Um, so I took it. I didn't have a place to live. When I went to HR, they were like, "What's your address?" I said, "I'm living in my car." Um, and I couch surfed for a while in Seattle until I made it work. But I don't know if there was ever a moment where I thought, "This is what I'm going to do for my life," um, until I met John Van Wyck. So my first week at Domain, you introduce yourself to all the VPs, they tell you what they do, try and get you to understand the company. And I met John and he was telling me what he did. And I said, "I want your job someday."
What was that job? What did he say it was?
He was the vice president of the strategic planning group. And he basically was like, "We look at the analytics of the donor file and make projections and talk about ways to improve it, see where it's underperforming. We do analysis and forensics on donor behavior." And that just fascinated me. And John, in his kindness and his desire to, inspire people into loving fundraising and loving generosity, he would invite me into his work. So he would leave his desk and work in the main conference room and just talk about what he was doing and how he was doing it. And he would just invite me to sit and watch. And eventually he hired me to work for him. And eventually, when he retired, he recommended me to become the vice president of analytics at Masterworks. But I followed him around from agency to agency for probably 15 years because he was such a good mentor and he was so generous with his knowledge and his time. And that is really the reason, I hit that goal of what I wanted as a female in, a nonprofit space, but also in a STEM role. It was really because of his generosity.
That's amazing. Do you feel like you've been able to pay that same thing forward? Have you been able to give opportunities or do something similar in the lives of others?
I really hope so. I try to make sure that what I know and what I have learned is accessible, that it's not just you have to ask. I try and give it freely. I know that, our current director of analytics was somebody who wasn't from that space, was really interested in it. And I tried to be really encouraging. How can we help you get there? And eventually recommended that they replace that space where I had sat. And now in the role that I have at Masterworks today as the Chief Philanthropic Economist, I really get to take a lot of what we know at Masterworks and make it available and make it accessible as a job to the industry as a whole. And I think that's just a shift in how we come to the market, is just being very open-handed so that the whole market lifts from all of our shared learnings.
I love the title of your role. I know. I think you do some most days, but I want to unpack each of the words. So Chief Philanthropic Economist. So the word chief implies that there's a certain leadership depth, experience, bench. It's tough to be a 20-year-old chief of anything. Philanthropic, walk me through that, and then economist. So unpack each of those words and what they mean to you and then how they form kind of your role today.
Yeah, so I've been doing direct response fundraising and being paid to do it, not just, the time when I was 5. I've been getting paid to do direct response fundraising for over 27 years. And I really think that's probably where that chief title comes from, is that, our space has a lot of burnout. People don't survive, for as long as you'd want, especially in the agencies, just because it can be a demanding role. And so I think, 27 years of doing this, loving it, and being passionate about really understanding and digging in. And I like not just learning about the fundraising space, but really how it's all playing into the economics as a whole. How does the for-profit space, how does the economics that we're facing, how do all of those play into our forecasting and what we can expect in the future and how we understand the past? So it's not just really about what's happening in the philanthropic world and the nonprofit space, although a deep understanding of benchmarks and donor behavior and what we're trying in our fundraising space helps. But really, how does that intersect with the economy as a whole?
In many ways, you are in this place where your philosophy, forensics, desire to investigate, it all is kind of, it all kind of merges together in many ways. Is this a role that you would have identified or chosen 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago? I mean, is this something that even existed? Like my wife works in a role that really didn't exist a decade ago.
I don't think it did. I think there were leaders in our space that really pushed the idea of it's not just a blog that you send out, but it's, trying to make it a part of your DNA and deep learning and all those things. But I think that's relatively new. The idea that it's it's a role that you invest in. Uh, I will say if somebody had said this is where I was going to end up, I probably would have thought it was a weird transition. I really and truly believed I would just be the vice president of strategy forever, um, which is strange because I've always really been driven. I've always tried new things. I've always wanted to learn. Um, but there's so much learning in that space. Every client is different. Every problem every year comes with different changes. And so I was somewhat fulfilled. And I don't think of myself as a writer. And so much of this role is writing.
Yeah.
I think I don't see myself as a writer because I don't write creatively. I am very much a bullet point, short, to the point, no fluff. I probably sound a bit like a robot in most of my writings, but also I'm not great at grammar. And so our proofers, I'm sure, love this about my role. So when I was offered this job, I was hesitant and probably resistant because it was not what I saw my future, and I wasn't sure what success looked like in a role that had never existed before.
Yeah.
And I like to succeed.
How would you define the contribution that the role makes to Masterworks, or to the actually not even to Masterworks? Let me rephrase it. What is the contribution this role makes to the mission of the organizations Masterworks serves? How does this make them better?
When your agency comes to an annual planning and they say, this is what we want to do, without context of why, without the whole story of what it is that the agency is thinking, what they're seeing, how they're processing the data, it feels out of place. And we had tried to overcome that years ago. We would put out these 5 blogs of these are our convictions right before annual planning. So it'd be like, here's what we're thinking and why, to kind of lead up, give people an idea of what's happening in the market. And I really loved writing those. I loved engaging in them. But it was just a moment. And it was only 5 blogs, and it was, only around specific people's annual planning. Not everybody plans at the same time. So this role has really allowed Masterworks to share a consistent and continual story from a variety of different people and subject matter experts into the market, saying this is how we see the world, this is how we see fundraising, and this is why we're doing what we're doing. Because if you just get this plan and it says, oh, we're going to change all these things without the whole context of how it plays into the market, it's hard to sell to their boards, to their internal teams. And so this role really allows Masterworks to provide that insight and make our plans seem holistic to where we're going in the future, which is something Masterworks has always thought about. It's something that is deeply ingrained in the DNA of this company and Steve. And this was just a really good way of sharing that.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And I can see the huge, I mean, firsthand, right, working with you, see the huge contribution it makes to our clients, to our work. Okay, so I want to ask you this question at a broad brush. What about philanthropic or philanthropy in general most excites you for the next, say, 12 to 24 months? Because things move fast, right? So I don't want this to be like a 3 to 5 year horizon, because it's bananas how fast things move. So what most excites you about the future of philanthropy? What most concerns you about the future of philanthropy?
To answer your question, I think they're really tied together, what I'm excited about and what I'm worried about. And starting with what I'm worried about, we started seeing the number of households participating in giving start declining in about 2008, which impacted, nonprofits donors and the number of active donors who were giving, how many of them were involved. And that's that retention. It's how many of these donors do we retain? And we started to see that retention, the number of retained donors, decline. And we saw the number of households participating in generosity in America start to decline back in 2008. And it was concerning, and we knew we had to fix retention, and we knew it was important. But acquisition was still working. And because acquisition was still working, the pressure to solve it wasn't there. And I don't think, as much as we talked about it, the metrics themselves haven't really changed. The benchmarks haven't really changed. When I started doing a data analysis of donor files, there was a 25% retention of new donors. There's still a 25% retention of new donors. Active donor files retain between 40 and 50%. They still retain between 40 and 50%. So for as much as we talk about this was an issue, we haven't actually solved it. And now we've come to a moment where acquisition is underperforming. The cost per donor is increasing, and the number of households is below 50%. The number of households participating in giving is below 50% across America, where in 2008 it was 66. So we are facing a bigger problem. Fewer households are giving, there are fewer donors to pull from, and retention is continuing to decline. And we now really do have to solve these in interesting and new ways because we've been trying, we've tested stuff, but it's not working. And so how do we improve our relationships with our donors so they want to stick around? So they understand that when they give, we kind of have an expectation that they're going to keep on engaging with us. And what does that look like in a direct response program? And that's what I'm really excited about, is solving that and learning that.
How much of what you just explained is the generational shift in understanding of giving? Like, my premise has been what we're seeing is the fruit of a completely new mindset having control over the pocketbook of our country. And we're going to continue to see it if we don't compete differently, which is why topics like brand and all the other things that have increasing importance. Is that your take? Like, what's your explainer for why we've seen these trends?
Every year that I have been doing this, the average age of a donor is 65. And I remember when the silent generation and the greatest generation were the majority of donors. And we kept saying, oh, those boomers, they're not going to give. They were hippies in their youth. And then they hit the 80s. They had that recession. And now they're not going to participate. And then lo and behold, they started to. Generation X might throw us a bit of a curveball, since I think millennials might be surpassing them as far as value, the last metrics I saw. But I still think that at the core of who we are, humans are generous. They're made in the image of God. They want to be part of the tribe. We are community people. That's how we survive. That's how we evolve. And so I don't think that there is a generosity crisis. I think who we are fundamentally as humans remains. When I see the decline happen, and it's starting in 2008, when the housing market crashed, when the 10-year recession, the lost decade, was supposed to come to a close and didn't for a lot of Americans, I think that what we're really seeing is a struggle of the middle class, because the mids and the majors are still giving. And when we saw in COVID credit card debt decline and people have savings, we saw a surge in giving. And then as soon as inflation hit and credit card debt increased, we saw that drop again. And to me, what I think we're seeing is less about the heart of people and more about the struggles people are going through right now.
So the macroeconomic realities is impacting philanthropy more than a decision not to give, or a lack of generosity, or a lack of care for the nonprofit space.
That's what I think. I mean, some do say like, oh, millennials give, but they're giving through direct and all these different things. But I don't see a lot of data. I know it's hard to, how do you get data that supports that? I understand that. But since this has been happening since 2008, And since there are these moments where the economy shifts and changes, and we see, oh, mids and majors are still giving whenever the stock market increases. But whenever debt declines, that's when we see those general donors re-engage again. To me, that signals more there's something going on to the people who are dropping off. And if it was retention across the board, I would say, oh, yeah, it's the heart. But since it's very specific to a group of donors, it seems like there's something else there.
One of the trends that seems unavoidable is the shift from check writing to giving digitally. Unpack that trend and that shift and maybe some of the implications for that over the next 5 years.
The check writing shift is fascinating. I had an employee call me. Actually, they sent me a Zoom link to explain to them how to write a check. This was a 26-year-old with a master's degree buying his first home, and he had to fill out a check, and he had no idea how to do it. And that's what we're facing. So few people in the millennial space even own a checkbook or know where it is. But I don't know how much that really changes our interaction with nonprofits the way we think it does. Because we used to measure interaction through source codes, and that was only obtained through gifts. So we assumed all of our interactions had to do with, I give you something that asks for money and you give me money back. And that was never the case. It was never the whole experience of a donor. It was just the part we could measure. And what's been interesting with the decline in checks is that it's really allowed us to talk about those other aspects more and more, because it's harder and harder to measure that interaction as only financial.
Mm.
I was talking with a CEO, and he was asking, how do we get planned giving up? How do we drive this forward? And I mentioned, asking for planned gifts, it's a long journey. It's not I'm going to ask and then I get. It's a journey that you have to take someone on, and it's going to take a while to get that planned gift, and you have to retain them the whole time.
And unpack what a planned gift is, just in case.
Yeah, it's when you get left in someone's will. So when they pass away and they leave you money. And a lot of nonprofits rely very heavily on it. So they're normally large gifts. But the issue is that asking for it has no immediate ROI. And it won't pay off for years. I think I looked, and the average lifetime between first gift and planned gift is well over 10 years. So the ROI on asking for that planned gift is zero. So people replace that tactic with something that has an immediate ROI. And that's the same thing with asking someone to become a monthly donor. The ask has a much lower ROI than just saying, there's an emergency, give us money. But which one's going to retain that donor longer? Which one's going to grow that donor further? And so we've had this, we want to make sure we're being efficient. Everything's measured by ROI at the direct source code. And now those numbers are declining. And we're starting to ask why. But we're also starting to ask, what were the other tactics we should have been doing that could have prevented a lot of these retention issues and revenue declines that didn't survive the budget review? And I think that's part of this check decline, is it's really forcing us to grapple with those issues and ask, how do we measure things outside of that, I send you mail and you give me a check?
What do you think the answer is? Like, as check writing declines, what will be the future of generosity to nonprofits when check writing is almost completely dried up? What is that horizon? 20 years?
I think it's faster than that. I'm trying to remember what the Bank of America estimates said when they were going to stop producing checks, basically, because they released something. I can't remember. Yeah, but it should be pretty soon.
It's like a piece of hardware that you've utilized for decades just becoming rendered obsolete. You no longer even have the choice to use it. We're not even going to take them anymore.
Right. Well, and so few people do anymore.
So we have this thing called direct mail, and direct mail has typically been for decades to get a check in the mail.
Right.
Does direct mail just go away when people stop writing checks, or does direct mail continue? And if so, why? How does the role of direct mail shift in a post-check era?
What we're seeing is that direct mail is going to continue to exist because you get 120 emails a day and 2 pieces of mail. And I don't check my mailbox often. I normally only check it when I get a mean letter posted to my door from my mailman, um, being like, "Can you please empty your mailbox for me?" But I do think that that ability to get in front of someone where they're not being inundated is going to keep it alive. The problem is that when that space isn't inundated, it probably means that it's expensive. And so I think the role of direct mail is going to stop being the mass, low cost, get those $10 donors to engage, and it's going to become more bespoke. And the role it's going to play isn't for, you know, calls to actions that are immediate, but really more relationship.
Cultivation of donors.
Yeah, the cultivation of the retaining of those donors, the building of that relationship so that they are aligned to you, your mission, and who you are.
So digital acquisition of new donors seems currently to be much more expensive than what direct mail acquisition is. Is that fair?
That is a fair assessment, yes. But you get a higher value donor. So we we typically see, acquisition costs at about a 0.5 ROI to what you get. So if you get a $40 cost to acquire, you're probably getting about a $20 donor. And what we're seeing in digital is that we might be spending $150 to $200 per donor, but we're getting a $75 to $100 donor. So we're still getting the same return on investment, and we're still getting the same, ROI metric, which means we're paying that investment off normally in the same amount of time between those two channels. One of them, you're getting a lot more donors, but a lot less value. And the other one, you're getting fewer donors, but higher value.
Unpack the higher value and the numbers you just said are less than the acquisition cost.
So generally speaking, when we do acquisition and nowadays is that it comes at a loss. So you're going to spend X amount of dollars and probably get about half of that back from those donors. So if you spend about $100, you'll probably get about a $50 first gift from a donor. And then that's where that retention and relationship play in and are so key to the long-term health of the file. So for our clients, we try and say, all right, what we want to do is acquire donors at a ROI that allows us to break even on that investment within 12 months. So we look at how many of those donors are going to retain, how much more are they going to give in that time period, and will that pay off the remainder of that acquisition in 12 months? And that way we can go to the board and say, it's a safe investment. You're not carrying this. You're not losing money. It will grow over time. And we check and make sure, is it really paying off in 12 months? Is it paying off in 9? Is it paying off in 18? And then we adjust the plans as a result of that.
So given the steep cost of acquisition and the critical need to cultivate relationship and maintain or retain donors over time, what does the research demonstrate as most effective techniques or reasons that donors stick around? And maybe it's not researched enough and you just have a gut, but what are the techniques, what are the things that ultimately help contribute to retention, to sustaining donors so that that initial acquisition cost is covered over time?
Donors generally join an organization because they have a personal connection to the cause. When we've done research asking, why is it you give to this organization or another, they generally answer with, I have a connection to the cause. And that you see this if you're the American Cancer Society, most people are giving because they know someone with cancer. Conveniently, we all pretty much know someone with cancer. Um, but if you were to ask people who give to a mission, why do you give to a homeless shelter? They would probably explain some personal connection. Not that they were homeless, not that they necessarily were on food stamps. Maybe they knew someone, maybe their family was helped, maybe a friend struggled with addiction. Maybe they, were told as a child you shouldn't give money, but you should support your shelter, and that's how they understand community involvement. But there's a personal connection, and so retention is really about finding what that connection is and showing that you're still solving that or still helping in that way. What we don't do well is that asking, that surveying, that collecting of data. But I think that's changing now as we look at how do I build this relationship better, and as technology allows us to have more pathways. It's not just mass communication anymore. It doesn't have to be. We can tailor our communication better if we have the technology support us.
You're going to walk into two different rooms and talk to two different groups of leaders. And I want to know what the top two things are you would want to say to them, or you would want them to most take away from whatever it is you're going to say to them. The first group are nonprofits that they're viable, it's working, but they're really small and young. Their, net revenue is $500,000 or less, and they're really wanting to grow and scale. The second room are nonprofits that are $50 million of revenue or greater. What are the two things that you would say you would most want to instill or plant in their brain if you could?
What we typically see with those smaller nonprofits is that the people they have on file know them, and their personal connection is really tight. Friends of the family, people helped. It's harder to know about a small nonprofit unless you know somebody there. So they have really good retention, but they don't have a lot of surround. They don't have a lot of awareness. And so what we recommend with them is, how do we build that awareness? How do we find that level out, the next circle outside of their friends and family, and go from there? We also want to focus on bringing in the right donors who are going to align to their mission long term, but also align to how they want to cultivate. So investing in monthly donors, mid-donor, caseload, those different things, because they have less resources, so they need to make sure they get a high ROI and get it quicker. When it comes to a larger nonprofits, they've probably capped out on a lot of, universe. They're known in the markets, and they probably have done a lot of acquisition. And I've noticed with those types of organizations, when they're doing acquisition, when they're bringing in people, they're looking in models that are looking at lookalikes, which is what you do. It's how you save money. I have a donor file that is 65-year-old, female, white, Christian. It's most of what donors look like across America. Looking at hundreds of nonprofit demographics across different organizations for 25 years, that's really been consistently it. They're 65-year-old white Christian women. But the demographics in America are changing. And what they found is that, Black communities report they would give to more mainstream nonprofits if they were just asked. I think that was Campbell research that came out. And same thing with Latino communities. They also report, nobody asks me to join. No one asks me to contribute. And so that's when it's about, how do we break into these other communities and invite them in? How do we make them feel included? And how is that real? It's not just to get their money. How do we truly invite them in? How do we speak their language? How do we open the doors up so that they can participate with us in this work? And this is something we've talked about for years. World Vision, that Steve Woodworth would probably tell us, back in the 80s, did entire campaigns in Spanish because they realized they were missing a market who truly are deeply Christian, deeply religious, and care. Um, and then, it's just not as effective as if we were talking to our lookalikes. And so rather than building it, it got cut. And we keep trying to bring those pieces out in fundraising. I've done these types of tests every 5 years for 25 years. And it's like, it's working. It's starting to work, but it's just not as effective as my lookalike. So we cut it. So knowing that, I would say the larger nonprofits have to create a space where they can innovate, where they can accept those lower ROIs and let something grow, so that they can break into these other channels and other demographics.
What's a specific example of that? Maybe it's not working or it hasn't worked yet, but what's an example of innovation in that 50 million or larger nonprofit that is something that is potentially going to lead to new opportunity?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm helping write a book right now on innovation and fundraising. And we talked with several different large nonprofits, Charity Water being an example, who I think you've had on the show, who have major donors that fund it, that fund, all their overhead. And that allows them to not have their ratio impacted by testing new ways of doing things. So they can innovate, they can bring it to major donors who are already in the mindset of, I'm supporting the growth, I'm supporting the foundation. And they can say, we want to try these new things. We don't know if it's going to work, and get that support covered. We've seen this with the navigators as well. They have had major donors come to them and say, I want to do something different. I want to try to help you reach people differently. Can I give money just for that? And so they have a department that helps with that. And even on a smaller scale, Atlanta Mission has their incubation lab, where major donors are funding the idea of, how do we reach the next generation? How do we innovate without it impacting our overall metrics, our ratio that we get judged on? Because that's really what prevents nonprofits from trying new things, from doing innovative things, from testing things, is that they get dinged by the oversight committees. And so it's safer to just slowly decline, because you're less likely to have a bad year and lose that fourth star.
Yeah, I want to get your opinion on two topics, but first, the one that most relates to what you just said. I have talked to nonprofit leaders who have literally said, we as a nonprofit, because of our board, because of our culture, would rather spend this percent overhead and only raise this amount of money than spend a much larger percent towards overhead to raise potentially 200% more money. There's this fear of spending. Do you encounter that? Do you hear that? Does your research demonstrate that there are places where they're just paralyzed to spend more than a certain percentage of their revenue on overhead, so they're stuck?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The oversight of nonprofits gives trust to the donors. And, losing donor trust in the nonprofit institution would be damaging, and probably never overcome. And so there is this beauty in these oversight committees, in this idea of how much is the right amount to spend in overhead, to spend in salaries, to spend in staff and innovation. But at the same time, it's a shackle, because the board understands they have to reach those accolades. They have to get those endorsements. And you can't get them unless you keep that overhead to a space.
And the endorsements come from what? Charity Navigator or?
Yeah, the Charity Navigator, the watchdog groups that are, doing a good thing in making sure that there is public trust in an institution. But at the same time, every coin has a front and a back. And so You want to make sure your overhead is healthy, but you also want to have the freedom to try. And so that's where a lot of nonprofits are balancing this with finding people who are willing to invest in that type of work.
Yeah, I love that. The other question I want to ask is around this term I use a lot, philanthrocapitalism. It seems to me that the for-profit space has a renewed energy around mission, the triple bottom line, giving back to society, being good stewards, and they get the benefit of doing that without the transparency or visibility of that the for-profit space is required to have. How big of a threat is that word philanthrocapitalism? How big of a threat is it to the nonprofit space, to philanthropy, because we're growing more and the gravitational pull towards consumerism doesn't seem to be slowing down, unless maybe the research suggests something different. Is that a threat, or do you think now the nonprofits are here to stay? Perception of nonprofits, like how significant is that headwind from your lens?
I think nonprofits are obviously here to stay, but what they look like and how they interact is going to change. And that's not they have been evolving. If you think back to, a lot of our missions and ministries, they started in the early 1900s and they're still around today. And how they interacted with their donors back then, going door to door and asking for money is much different than how they interact today. And I don't think that's something to be feared, but I think if you're not willing to change, then you don't survive. And we all understand that. You have to evolve with the changing times or else you'll get left behind. And so I don't think it's something to be feared. I think it's something that we have to acknowledge. I am interested, though, in going back to the idea of trust. Every year I go to my grocery store and they are like, hey, buy a Thanksgiving meal. And I remember one time I'm standing there with my mother, who's a 65-year-old white Christian female in that perfect donor age. And she's like, why would I help this brand that I don't really like get a tax write-off with my money? And she was appalled at the idea. And I realized in that moment, she had more trust in the institution of the mission to give the Thanksgiving meal than she did at her grocery store to do it for her. And I think that's where we win. There are other brands like Tom's and these ones that you're like, I trust them to actually do good and to give that back. But when it comes to the major corporations, the large groups, I just think that, again, there's trust in a nonprofit more than there's trust in most of these large corporate brands. And that's where we win.
What does it look like for a nonprofit to build and cultivate meaningful relationship and connection with its donor base if it's not through direct mail like it used to be?
I think when we look at, check writing pulling back and direct mail changing its role in how we communicate, the donor relationship changes as well. And it already has changed in all our other avenues of life. Like, my children talk to their grandma via text. And when I think about how do you communicate to your donors, I really do like to think about how do you communicate to your grandma. And, for, I suppose, most of us professionals, we don't have one anymore. So I look to my children. But when I started out in the fundraising world, I wrote my grandma a handwritten letter every week. That's how I communicated with her, because it was truly meaningful to her to get something in the mail. She was lonely. This meant something. My children now text their grandma, and that's how she interacts with them. And these are the ways I kind of think about where should we be moving? How should we be testing new channels? And where are we seeing relationships shift? And so how do we communicate to our tribe, to our people, and to our elders in a way? And how does that change? But the other thing about that is it's harder to measure. And that's why it doesn't get utilized as much. Because if my kids texted their grandma asking for Robux, for their video games, free money for their video games, every text, she wouldn't want them to talk to her. They text her, "How are you?" every morning. "This is what I did in school. This is what I'm excited about." And then occasionally, I will admit, I'm pretty sure, they're like, "Hey, and also, could you send me some Robux?" Um, which she does. And I think this is where we're at as nonprofits. I get an email every single week from the Natural Resource Defense Council, and I don't open them. I've never opened them. I've never clicked on them. But I read the subject line and it says, "We're fighting this battle. We're taking on this law. We're doing this." And I read that, and in my head, I check off they're accomplishing and they're working and they're doing something. And it's not asking me for money. But when it's time to give, in my head, I know they're active. I have another nonprofit who sends me a text about once a week. Some people would hate this. I get that. Their texts never ask me for money. They're just like encouraging. "We love you. You did this cool thing. We helped this person because of you. Thank you for being awesome." And then once every 2 months, it's an ask for money. And they can't measure those other texts because they didn't ask for money. But I wouldn't have given to that one if they did. And so how do we start measuring all of the tactics to build a relationship, to increase donor value? And that's something that at Masterworks we've thought a lot about. In 2019, we started testing, hey, digital donors don't give to direct mail. Why are we sending it? So we took it away and saw retention drop. How much mail do they need? What kind of mail? Do they ever give to mail? And what we found is they never give to mail, but they needed about 10 to 12 pieces a year to retain. On a budget sheet, those tactics have no ROI. But we lose donor value without them. And we have to start having those conversations. If you don't send that person emails anymore and they don't see that subject line that you're working, do they keep retaining? If you send those texts that are just encouraging and just to share your accomplishments, you're not getting money, but do they retain? In some of our interviews, we talked to a gentleman named Angel Loma, and he was just going on about all the cool technology he brought to Food for the Poor, new CRM systems, technology to get receipts out faster, satellite communication to the field, and all this stuff. And we're like, "Man, you are such an innovator." And he's like, I don't really think I'm going to be helpful because I'm not an innovator. And he didn't see any of these cool things he's describing as innovations. He fixed roadblocks to connection with people. And all of that investment wasn't an ROI to him. It was a way to connect to a person. And that's what he was chasing. And I think that's the mentality we have to start bringing to our fundraising. And that's how we start solving retention. It's not about innovating for the sake of innovating. It's not about communicating for $1. It's about what are the barriers that are stopping me from connecting to this person.
It seems like there's a ton of consumer research that looks at these things. What are the subtle ways that consumers make decisions and choose dish soap, from color to placement on a shelf to all the things that are really hard? In many ways, I feel like we need to do that level of donor research. We need to understand what motivates, connects. Is that in some ways a new level of depth of research, a new level of, like, in some ways, maybe we haven't needed to do the research that we need to do in the future because it was a much more measurable, clear ROI, cause and effect, and that's changing? Or has it always been somewhat muddy and blurry and not as clean cut? Like, are we heading in a direction where things are getting more subtle and more difficult to fully understand and measure? Is acquisition fundamentally shifting in how we count and measure?
Yeah, I think it is. I think how we count and measure is fundamentally shifting. I think we haven't done the research as deeply as we should for several reasons. Again, it doesn't have an ROI to it. It doesn't bring in money that you can tie to a budget. So it was never an investment that people wanted to make when there were more immediate money generating solutions that they could put on a budget that could be easily board approved. What is my return on this research? It's like 5 years out. um, I think that really plays in. But I think the other thing is, 20 years ago, we went out to our donor base for a nonprofit and asked them, like, what are you interested in? Why do you give? What is it that we're solving in, international development that really sparks your interest and retains you as a donor to our cause? And people wrote in and answered. And we collected it. And we actually put it into the database and we actually used it, which in and of itself right there is amazing. We don't always retain the information that we collect cleanly. And we used it to market. But because of technology, it increased retention, it increased value, but it increased costs. And so we stopped. And so now that we're coming to a space where we can do these things without it increasing costs, without it being a huge lift in time and energy and different versioning and review and writing and designing, once we've come to a place where that connection is more obtainable, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more nonprofits actually asking, surveying, and then taking that information to heart. Because if you survey and you don't use it, it's actually more insulting than just not asking at all.
Okay, last question. You're a chief philanthropic economist. You're an analyst. You wanted to be the X-Files. I can't remember her name. Rebecca.
Scully.
No. Scully. Oh my gosh. Scully. I know. So you want to pursue truth. You want to understand reality. You don't want to live deluded. Where have you held a conviction or opinion that data or research most changed you?
It's not actually true. I was going to say I like to hold truths loosely, but no, I don't. I hold them deeply and with conviction, and I don't shift. But I think my convictions are less about behavior and more about core. So when people talked about the generosity crisis, I bristled because I truly did not believe that the soul of people had changed. I really believed we are made in the image of God, and therefore who we are at our center remains. So there had to be something else. And I truly believe that people love to share and they love to be generous. And so if they're not, it's either a lack of resource or we haven't engaged them. And I think for me, channel, tactics, messaging, all of those different pieces are always going to change. We're always going to test, move, learn more, shift. Because the market and how we engage, how I talk to my grandma changes, how my kids talk to their grandma changes. That's a given. But the fact that my kids want to engage with their grandma, they want to talk, they want to have that relationship, that's a constant. And that's really where I build my beliefs, is who we are as humans.
So as a philanthropic economist, as a researcher, as an analyst, you still do all of that research built upon a point of view. And that point of view is that people do actually want to be generous, do find fulfillment in generosity. And that is a lens in which you view even the data.
Yeah, you have to believe that humanity is generous. They want to give. They want to see positive change. They want the direction we are heading to take us to a better place, because it benefits us all as a whole, And so I do believe that. I come at this with the idea not that I am fighting headwinds of, a declining moral base, but that I am opening up the door so people have an easier time accessing that which they already want.
Let's assume that is true, and yet there is selfishness. Consumerism and selfishness are often two sides of the same coin. Do you believe that is on the rise, giving friction or holding back the generosity that maybe was a little bit more unleashed in previous generations? Or do you believe selfishness and self-centeredness is at the same operating level as previous generations?
I think it's at the same operating level. I think what opportunity we have is that this time, not generation, this time and all the generations in it are feeling more disconnected. There's higher anxiety, there's more depression. And the interesting thing about the act of giving is that it sets off your dopamine, and it brings you joy, and it brings you peace. The act of giving lowers your cholesterol, your blood pressure. It improves your relationships with your families. They've done studies that show it makes your sex better. Like, the very act of giving improves every aspect of your life. And so in a time when we're feeling disconnected, when depression's on the rise, when anxiety is increasing, the selfishness of giving it makes me feel better. And that's how that's why it still works, even if there's darkness, because it is something that actually makes us happy.
And I think what's encouraging is that all the research and analysis that you do continues to reinforce that premise, not necessarily challenge it or threaten it.
And if we did see something threaten it, that would be fascinating, and we would publish it, and we would find out why.
But thus far, the research does not challenge that core premise or point of view that you bring into this work.
I think there will always be someone who says, we're not really made in the image of God, and
Of course, yeah.
We slowly decline just like the sun and entropy and all those different things. I think that's a valid point, everything decays and so does morality. I just think if you look through history, we've only gotten better.
For more stories from experts in the industry and to learn how to take your nonprofit into the future, like this video, subscribe to our channel and podcast, and visit makehistoric.com/insights. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Ted Vaughn, and this is Future Nonprofit.